All right, welcome to the Arsenal podcast. Likely we're going to be doing a lot of these, which is going to be fun. My name is BJ McKay. I'm the owner, CEO of the Arsenal, also a leadership consultant and a professional coach. With me is Eric Van Matre, the head coach at the Arsenal. And today we're going to be talking about a subject that's often misunderstood, not only just by like parents but by athletes and just a lot of people, is sports performance. And what is sports performance? So if you're tuning in today to listen, we're not going to be talking about necessarily Arsenal programming. Here's what we would do. Here's what to buy from us. That's not the point of this exercise. Really, we're just going to be talking. Eric, who is has master's degree in this, over a decade of experience in this field. And I have 6 kids, so I have plenty of experience being a dad and paying for things and paying for my kids to get training. So we're going to break down a few of the big questions in the sports performance realm, not only for youth athletes, but for athletes who are no longer in like college or youth settings, adults, if you will, all the way to folks that are aging in your 60s, 70s, 80s, and even 90s. What does this subject matter have to do with you? So I'm excited for this long-ranging chat. How are you today, Eric?
I'm doing great. I'm excited as well. I'm excited. I hope this is some information that helps people understand the importance of, like you said, not just youth sports performance training, but training as an athlete of life, as we'll discuss a little later on. And so how there's a lot of commonalities between, but there are some differences and some things that you need to look for as you go to just kick life in the butt a little bit better.
Excellent. Well, let's dive right in. So the first question here is, what exactly is sports performance training and why is it important, Eric?
Yeah, so youth sport performance training it's really exercise or fitness-based protocols that are really created or performed to help achieve a desired outcome and really to minimize risk of injuries. So, really when an athlete goes in to train, not just with us, most of the time when they go places, they're looking to get a little bit better at their sport, become a little more resilient so they're less likely to break down and get hurt. This is something you actually see a lot of studies through the ASCM, American College of Sports Medicine, and the NSCA, National Strength and Conditioning Association, on youth training, youth development, youth performance, things like that. They talk about training as really as safe as 5 to 7 years old, but it looks very different than what you're going to see in a 15, 16, 17-year-old prepubescent athlete.
So is sports performance training just for, do you feel like it's best labeled and used for youth? Because when you think of sports, like, all right, sports performance training, you think about a parent's like, I want my kid to get faster, stronger, jump higher, like whatever it is. I mean, is it that tight, like the labels that they use that tight around that, or is it broader?
I think it's broader. I think there's a lot of misconception or misperception in what performance training is. Really a lot of people want to come in and specialize in a lot of things. And this is something, again, you can refer to these ACSM and NSCA studies I'm referring to. They have, I have a few here that I referenced that talk about optimizing the development of an athlete throughout the course of their lifespan and their training span. Really when it comes down to setting up an athlete for training, we need to make sure that, one, we're staying safe, right? But then from there, they're really coming in to try and get better at their sport, whatever that they think or they perceive that their lacking is. So they think when they come in, they're just going to go hard all the time at that one thing that they just kind of suck at, right? When in all reality, like that's part of it. That definitely is a highlight of performance training, and in the short term, you'll see great results with that. But if you don't have that well-rounded base and that well-rounded foundation, it's like building a house or building a pyramid. If you don't have a big base, you can only build so high, right? So how high are we really trying to climb is going to really matter on how big of a foundation do you set, or how well is your foundation set.
Cool. Well, I guess the counterpoint to this question is where if sports performance is where we're working, from what I'm hearing from you. So we're working on building a foundation, all the things that get like transferred to a field, a court, the field of play, if you will, if I'm in a sport, whatever that might be, or even like if I'm older, like a triathlon, a pickleball court, something like that, it transfers over. So I guess where's the boundary on sports performance? So if I'm thinking about it and I'm like, I'm going to do sports performance training. My kid's going to do sports performance training. Sports performance training is important. Like, where does it end? Like, what's not sports performance training? Or maybe some places where people get wrong. We're like, I'm doing sports performance.
Yeah. I think, as you'll find in this field a lot, it depends. I think one of the big things is what's your perception? I mean, this day and age, we have, e-gaming leagues, right? So how do you increase performance for that? And
a lot of wrist exercises. Is that all right?
You have a lot of different things for the sport itself, but the same thing in exercise, right? Like you're starting to see some of these professional e-gaming sports teams hire fitness and nutrition professionals to keep them healthy and active, so they can stay focused and perform better in the video game, right? So again, what's our perception of it?
Gotcha.
I think that's going to be where it really lies. I think some of that comes to framing it from the coach. I think understanding and letting the parent know that, hey, we are here to help with the things that you want to help with. I think it's really important to build those weaknesses and those things you struggle with. Like, those are especially going to be the wins that help you want to come in the door more because you see the turnaround. But in that, if you understand how to build a protocol properly, or you're working with someone who knows how to do so properly, you're setting yourself up for not just that short-term success, but that long-term success down the road as well.
So it sounds like sports performance and the actual sport itself, when it comes to like going to like a practice, there are concentric circles that can overlap over each other. So if I'm doing like a warm-up drill in like the batter's box with like donuts on my bat, and I'm swinging my arms left and right, like I'm back and forth, like it's kind of in that middle space, right?
Yep.
It's my pre-warm-up before I'm getting on there, but what am I doing? I'm loosening up my shoulders, I'm limbering up, like I'm calibrating my energy, my power, etc., which is something that we'd probably do in sports performance. So you can kind of nest it right in there, which is probably why it'll go. I don't want to get ahead of myself for the next question we have, like why there's maybe some misperceptions, because there's no real clear, bold line. I am doing sports performance training. And I like what you shared earlier about like the e-gaming league. Like, they're getting these nutrition coaches, and the leadership work that I do with executives and leaders at a lot of different levels. They talk about things and they take it from like an intellectual knowledge and a skill-based approach when it comes to, I'm going to lead, and here's a model I'm going to use to manage my team or to scale my company. But a lot of like what's behind it is like, I want resilience. I want a resilient team. How are you going to do that? How are you going to intellectualize that? Or I want a team that's got grit. Well, how much hard stuff do they do outside of like paperwork and like just project related things? And I want my team to have energy. All right. You going to tell them about it? Or are you going to just say magic words and motivate them? Are you going to just give them plenty of time off and then they're going to get re-energized? And I'm like, that's not necessarily the case. So it sounds like there's a case to be made that like, maybe sports performance isn't the question as much as like, what's your sport?
Yeah.
If your sports, I'm going to grow a company. My sports, I want to do X, Y, and Z. What does it take to do it? Because you could take like gaming league and cross that over to like leading a business, leading a field sales team, like all of those different things. So I think like what is sport could be even expanded, and maybe even just like isolating performance training. Yep. You can almost go down to that level.
I think a big part of it too comes down to, and this is something I really love, Dr. Andy Galpin refers to a lot, like what is your intent, right? I think it goes down to like you and I could be doing the same exercise, but if we're focused on different things, we're going to create different adaptations. You're going to have some carryover. Like you said, you have those concentric circles, right? But the more that I have my intent differed in what I'm doing in the application, it's going to steer me down the road in a different direction in terms of like the outcome I'm achieving. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it's like the outcome you need to, if you're doing sports performance, I have an athlete in sports performance, it's centered around the outcomes from the sport backwards in instead of the other way around.
Correct.
Okay, cool. All right, let's dive back into youth for a second with the next question. So doesn't my athlete get this from our high school strength coach? Like they have a weight room there. It seems like they're doing a lot of training over there. Wouldn't doing additional like sports performance work be redundant or maybe even too much for a youth athlete?
Yeah, and so there's a wide variety of skill and ability at a high school level, typically. you're starting to see a lot more schools invest in the strength conditioning and performance side of things. I think it's really cool seeing a lot of development that we're getting, this day and age with, schools that are offering more than what college salaries are. Like they don't, some of these bigger schools are offering more than what a college strength and, Division I strength and conditioning salary is. And so they're really investing in, the development of their athletes. I think that when it comes to issues that you're often going to find, though, in that high school weight room, oftentimes you're going to be understaffed. Depending on the size of the school, if you have 20, 30, 40 athletes in at a time or more, and you only have 1 or 2 coaches for 30, 40, 50 athletes, it's really hard to make sure athletes move well. I struggle with this. I work with Ball State baseball, and it's, all the athletes move significantly better than when I started with them. But I can't work with each one individually every day because we only have an hour at a time, And so that's another thing I would say that you're going to run into in that high school realm is what's my time like? What's my time frame? My brother's strength conditioning coach at a small 1A high school, and there's some, for the size of their school, they've really invested a lot into it. Their weight room's awesome. But he gets a lot of the time with his athletes. He gets them during a 50-minute class period, a 45-minute class period. He has to leave time for attendance on the front end, leave time for a shower at the back end. He gets about 25 to 27 minutes a session with them. And yes, I can accomplish things in that, but is it helping me accomplish the most out of what I want?
All right. So we have the 2 things I pulled from that is you have an athlete to coach ratio, which you're working against, and relevant time constraints but for those 1 or 1.5 coaches that are there. So if I'm doing something outside of school, I'm outside of like my strength program, I suppose, like, what are the main things that you typically see or they see in the field that are the real value adds? So I do my school program because I want to stay with my team, right? I want to do the stuff that my team's doing, kind of generalized strength program or generalized conditioning program. I want to be with my team to do all that stuff. What are kind of the extras that, maybe not extras, but the other fundamental things that having sports performance as a part of the kind of coaching mixture that I'm putting together for my athlete, it makes a ton of sense and is unlikely to be fostered in that environment?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things, just use myself with an example and some of the athletes I've worked with, one of the things that you'll run into, again, it's kind of that time frame, but even a school that has a good program in place, there's always going to be holes. If you don't have an athlete every day and you're able to develop this program every day, even if it's just some mobility work and some low intensity conditioning work, there's things that are probably being left on the table to some extent, right? And so what are the things that I can accomplish even if I'm taking what they do over there, I'm just filling the holes in that. You take any of my programs that an athlete comes in 2 to 3 days a week, and there's holes that are going to be had in there. There's no program that's perfect, right? But I think being able to fill those holes that the program provides. So I communicate with my athletes. What are you doing? What's your program look like? Especially if they know in advance. A lot of the strength coaches will do 4-week strength blocks or cycles, and I'm able to get a copy of that in advance so I can program or plan around. The other thing I really like about that setup is when someone is doing something well, that's less I have to focus on over at our facility, right? I have a football player that's an offensive lineman that's going to be a senior this next year, and they squat 2 days a week, at his 3 of his sessions at school. So in his 3 other days over with us, he squats maybe 1 day a week. And a lot of what we do, it varies around whatever he's done at school. We tend to favor a little more front squatting because they favor more back squatting, which you'll oftentimes see in high school. So I think there's things that you can do around it. One of the things I love to do, and this is my personal bias, but Olympic weightlifting. There's not a lot of high school programs that teach it well, and if they do, and it's not a knack on high school strength coaches, the time and the space and the energy, it's just hard to do. And so if an athlete has a program has a pretty good, the school program has a pretty good strength program in place, I can spend some more time working on skills of training. So then when they go back to their high school weight room, they can develop the skills and they can develop stronger and faster over what they're doing there. So I think that's a big key in what you can do too.
So really, it depends. What does my high school get from our high school strength coach? Kind of depends on where you're at, I suppose. So if they have a ton of strength coaches, there is a lot of one-to-one, even dedicated if you're in a big enough school. For our listeners in Perth, Australia, and in London, or in Dallas, Texas, right, you might have a pretty well-outfitted group, even with performance mindset coaches and all of these other like wraparound folks, but in most places, it's unlikely that's going to be the case. So I'm getting a lot of good things from my high school strength coach in the most part, but I really need to go back to sport performance. Like what's my unique circumstance, and what gaps, it sounds like, might I not be getting filled by that are going to matter as it relates to my durability, my agility, my speed, all the things that I want to show up on the field for either myself or my athlete. Cool.
Yeah.
How about this? All right, I'm going to put you on the spot. What are the top 3 things that sport coaches neglect when it comes to an athlete's ability to perform at their best?
Yeah, I'm going to throw this out. It depends. You're going to hear this a lot in this field because it really is. There's a lot of it depends variables. Common things that you will often see, however, lack of focus or emphasis in a warm-up and a down regulation or cool down. Not preparing the body for the demands you're about to ask of it, so you can get the most out of it, and then pulling yourself back out of that fight or flight situation. Because when we go into sport or training or exercise, we are putting the body into a fight or flight state. We're doing it intentionally. And so if we do not pull ourselves out of it, especially this day and age with all the blue light and all the, external stressors we have, that just elevates significantly. And so if we can't pull ourselves back out, some simple basic breath work. I listened to Dr. Galpin and Huberman. It's kind of a joke lately, as if Huberman said. Andrew Huberman's a neurophysiologist through Stanford, neurobiologist, I think physiologist, I don't remember. He works with the central nervous system of the brain. He's very intelligent. But they talk a lot about that. And so, being able to pull yourself out through your breath is really one of the big keys. But then some easy mobility work. What's some of the muscles that we just worked hard and stressed out, and let's create a little bit more length or elasticity in them at the end. It's going to help increase blood flow to things. So I think that's a big one there is lack of emphasis or focus in a warm up and a cool down. Another one that I see, and I'm guilty of this, I still have to fight myself on this at times, but focus on mastering the basics longer. Really just keeping an emphasis in mastering the basics. The 6 fundamental human movements: squat, hinge, press, pull, lunge, and carry. If you get really good at those movements, you're going to be able to carry those over into almost any demand that sport's going to play. There's other things. We're going to move through different planes. You start talking about lunge, like are we doing a lateral lunge or reverse lunge, forward lunge, step up, similar lunge movement. So, there's different ways to apply those, but if you are well-rounded in implementing those variables, you're generally going to be able to master most other movements or pick up on most other things faster. And then the last, I would say, and this comes a little bit more on the relationship side. This is something that last year I went to Soreneck Summer Strong and listened to, I think there's 12 strength and conditioning professionals that go and speak there for about an hour. It's a seminar with about 600 meatheads, that you think it's just this big weightlifting, gunslinging show. And it is to an extent at times, but really the thing that was kind of shocking is 9 or 10 of the speakers last year, I would say almost half of their speech was on mental health and relationship building with your athletes. And building that trusting relationship to know how is your athlete wired? What motivates them? What keeps them disciplined? How are you going to get the most out of them? Right. I think if you don't understand how to get the most out of them and you're just coaching them one way, you may leave an athlete out to dry or out on the table because they weren't able to absorb or take in the content you were trying to deliver to them properly. There may be untapped potential there that, never gets completed comes to fruition because of, understanding how that athlete's wired.
Yeah. Good 3.
Yeah.
I think another intermixed in that, especially on the last one, I see this in business too, is the lack of intentionality in programming fun. Doing something just for fun because it's a good time and you're with people that you like, and even stuff off the field of play, like off the court. And I talk to people like, hey, how about get out of the boardroom? How about less PowerPoint slides? How about it's like, why don't we go out? What do your people like to do? How about challenge them? Have you ever gone for a walk together in a meeting? A walk in a meeting? Walk? Yeah. What about no, they all have to leave their phones. They have to leave this and they have to go out and do it. I'm like, why? Because you typically don't.
Yep.
And I think in a relationship with an athlete, how do I calibrate when's the brake, when's the gas pedal? And then when to move to the periphery, even in in Olympic weightlifting, when are you doing whatever, like elevated like poles and like slow eccentric motion. It's like you kind of add those things to rehone focus, not because it's like, oh, this is going to be 90% the reason why you do. It's just making it interesting enough for people to keep showing up. And I think when you think about that, not just like mental health, but just sport burnout.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you keep people calibrated? Like actually want to go.
Yep.
Actually want to show up and do something different. So,
well, and I think a good reference to that too, if you've ever read the book Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, he talks about in there a lot of kids at young ages. They talk about hockey specifically in Canada. Their cutoff age for school is the first of the year, and so they were watching a youth or junior national championship. I think 17, 18-year-old males, and 75. I think it was like 75 to 80% of the roster on both teams was born March or earlier. And it's like, oh, that's strange, But then you start breaking it down, and if these athletes that develop faster, younger, they get better opportunities to better teams nowadays, better travel ball, better skill coaches because they want to take on better athletes. What's that do for an athlete that's just a late bloomer, And so that's where, again, if you understand your athlete, you understand how to get the most out of them and see more of that potential in there.
That's awesome. Thanks, Eric. All right, let's talk about resources. So you nerd out about this a lot, and with several of our coaches at the gym. And I know anybody listening to this is like, all right, great. It's like, who should I look to when it comes to training youth athletes? Like, where are the places that I should go if I can't, like, I don't have a local like gym. I have maybe a YMCA. My kid has like their school gym, or we have a home gym. Like we work out in the basement. I used to play sports. Where would you direct people when it comes to finding kind of legitimate like training for youth athletes?
Yeah, so I've got 3 resources that I really like. One, I'm a little biased, but he's my former weightlifting coach, Travis Mash. He's going back to get his PhD right now and works. He's one of USA Weightlifting's senior 4 international level coaches, head weightlifting coach at Lenore Ryan University. He has a lot of research on this, and he's got 2 young boys, maybe 3 actually. They're starting to do things at that. I think he's got a 5-year-old roughly, something like that. But they're starting to get into it. And so he has a lot of research that he's been doing and putting out there. You can find him on LinkedIn and, really any social media. He puts a lot of information out. Probably the OG of youth strength training and youth performance training is Avery Feigenbaum. I have used a lot of his stuff in the past when I first started creating a lot of my principles early on, and really emphasizing skill and technique and movement first. When you're training a youth athlete, it's really more about teaching coordination, and we're teaching them how to, handle more load and more capacity. We're creating better tissue tolerance. We're doing the things that help them, again, are relative to the demands that they're going to face in their day-to-day or in their sports and activities. And so Avery Feigenbaum is a very good resource as well. And then really the NSCA, the National Strength and Conditioning Association, they put out a ton of great information. You'll find all sorts of great resources on there, great authors and research articles on there, and things that they've put out about youth sport performance training and how to progress a youth. At what ages or age ranges, it's always going to be an it depends situation. But at what age ranges do we kind of start looking for what level we should be doing or what should we be focusing on in training? At that younger age, especially before puberty's hit, we want to focus a lot more on coordination and skill, and then develop work capacity so they can just handle more. Because if you can handle more, you'll also be able to recover better, right? And that's a big part that you're going to see missing out, especially more this day and age with the social media, the technology, all the blue light we put in our life. Sleep is really starting to plummet. I think you're starting to see an emphasis in it better, but I think that's something that, again, you'll see resources that are put out by these guys. MASH puts out a lot of stuff about the effects of that and youth training, and especially with college athletes. He sees a lot of that. He tracks everything, and he sees all that data and the effects that it has. Wow.
All right, so there's the 3. There's 3 big ones that you get right from the mind of Eric that he's going to. And I think I'd direct you to this too if you're mom coach or dad coach and you have an athlete, hey, there's a gap, but I don't know if there's any coaches that can spend time with my athlete. You can do it. I mean, thank you, YouTube. Thank you for all these things. Like I had some like a pull-up bar that my dad put in our basement, some like slide on weights, I think like a big gigantic pulley from like some sort of machine, and Flex magazine.
Yep.
So I was basically all set for sports performances. It was a perfect setup for me growing up. But now there's so much out there. It's almost like I think folks don't know where to start.
Yeah.
So to hear from a coach, you do this all the time. You probably vetted out a lot of like pretenders or pseudo experts, which you see online all the time. I think that's 3 great places to go if you're thinking like, what should I do? Where should I look? Those would be some good ones. All right, let's switch gears. Let's talk injuries. So when you're working with athletes, you shared earlier, all right, injury prevention, and make sure we're durable, make sure we can stay out in the field. What are the most preventable injuries that coaches miss in their training, either leading up to sport, off season, or during a season, just unilaterally?
Yeah. Well, one, I think it's important to clarify that nothing's totally avoidable, right? Like we don't necessarily know what positions an athlete's going to get in on the field, on the court, especially the stress state they're in, things of that nature. But there's a lot of things we can minimize the risk in.
That's what I'm saying, right? Just the most preventable.
So I just got to make sure I'm clear on that, right? Because you can't avoid everything, right? But we can really reduce the risk of things. And so one of the things that I see a lot of and that you'll see a lot of physical therapists talk about and deal with is foot, ankle, and knee issues. A lot of it just stems from our footwear, right? And I would actually take that a step further and say that goes to stem from our lack of foot awareness and foot strength. I think that, we get locked up in these shoes, and think about if you're wearing like a cotton like glove, right? And then I put an oven mitt over that. How good is my proprioception, my sense of feel and touch, and I can grab things, right? Well, think about like the hands are the feet of the lower body. So when I have my foot always in that glove of, really, I don't even say that, it's a mitten, really. Most of our socks, unless you're wearing toe socks, I do that sometimes.
You're a weirdo.
I do. I have toe spacers on right now too. Anyways, but they're really more in that mitten and then a thicker mitten over them. And so, I have no real ability to feel and grasp myself into the ground, which is my direct connection to, take me to move or jump or run, whatever I want to do. So footwear and stability up that chain through the foot, the ankle, and the knee. I think another big thing that you'll see is a lot of low back and hip issues that can often be minimized. Again, I don't want to say totally avoidable, but minimized through just good, strong trunk and core training. I tell all my athletes, your core is your shoulders through the hips. And I really like to teach my youth athletes core, shoulders through the knees. Like it's the core of the body. It's that center portion of the body. It's not just your abs. Your abs are a portion of your core. It's not your entire core. So getting a strong trunk and strong hips, glutes, especially glutes and adductors, but those are the basis of your spine. And so if you don't have a good base or a good foundation of the spine, you're going to see things trickle up chain.
It just seems like that, what you just shared, it is not, it seems like it wouldn't be missed in a gross fashion. It just seems to be missed in terms of like volume over time. Mm-hmm. It seems like you feel like you hit it and then you can kind of move on. And I think it's those gaps and that lack of consistent training that opens up those areas for injury when you move. I just personally feel that way when like, I'm in really, really good shape. If I go out and chop wood, I'm like, I feel like I get hit by a truck. Mm-hmm. Like, why did that hurt? I'm like, well, when's the last time you did that movement? When's the last time you did a spinning turn? Like, if the answer is not very much, my body's going to tell me that story. But it's like, no one's trying to hit me back.
Yeah.
And like in other sports where there's other forces playing on my body. So I could just see how you can get in compromised positions from that.
Well, and I think a lot of the things that we use to build those, plank holds, glute bridges, things of that nature, just stability work, that seems basic. It's not the sexy stuff. And once you start to get good at it, even though it may continue to be implemented, what is your intent? Going back to what we talked about earlier. If I don't have the intent to keep everything rigid and tight as possible and really challenge it, if I'm not challenging it, am I going to create adaptation that it's going to get stronger? Right? And
maybe coaches communicating to the athletes how this is going to cross over to sport.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think the stuff that I left out, and I coach pole vault at our local high school, and it's trying to keep them not bored when they're doing the things that must be done, like over and over and over. And I talk about when am I going to get this? When you get to 10,000, 20,000 reps? What? Yeah. Well, how am I going to? Yeah, you better just keep doing them every day like I have. And over time, you won't have to think about this anymore.
Yep.
Same thing with core, glute strength, like all the way down, and feet. Like, how many coaches right now are like, everyone take your shoes off. We're going to be doing drills with like this. We're going to be doing barefoot walks, barefoot run, like all those things. I bet it's out there, but I bet that's pretty rare. And like, do you have a lawn at home? Most people listening probably do. You know what I mean? Can you do like a lot of this stuff's pretty accessible, if you will,
Well,
to do.
You also got to be really cautious when you start trying to implement these things. Like if you go out and you're like, oh man, I've been in a shoe for 20 years. I never go around barefoot. And you go out and just try and barefoot run, like you're probably going to hurt yourself, you know? You need to make sure that, again, the body can handle the demands you're about to try and impose on it. And so do I have the tissue tolerance in that? Do I have the range of motion to do the things that I'm trying to do? Like, you want to slowly progress and build your way into those things. And that's why it's important to have a good training program in place that helps make sure that you can see that plan and that progression to where you're trying to get to and make sure it makes sense. But if you go out and just be like, oh, I'm going to start running with my shoes off, and you go out, even on an open field or turf field, it's soft cushion, nice and level, like you're likely to have some sort of muscle strain at minimum.
I feel like that way when I'm like going to the beach and I get in my car, I have to walk over like large gravel.
Yeah.
I realize how weak and soft I am when I take my shoes off. If you ever want an ego hit, if you're listening, that's a great way to just show like I'm fit and I'm like, I can handle anything. Take your shoes off and walk across that gravel. Like that'll be really put it in a perspective for you. And then you watch people in third world countries like sprinting full speed over like broken glass and you're like, what just happened? It's like that training adaptation that comes in. Any other things you feel is worthy to share for anybody listening for preventable injuries and maybe even things I can do about it?
Yeah, I think the one thing that, and I'll always bias this because it is my field, my realm, but muscle is protection, right? And so the more mass or muscle mass you have around a joint, generally it's going to protect the joint. However, that muscle needs to be functional. So if you take a bodybuilder, for instance, that has a lot of muscle, what's the function of that, right? The function that they performed is just to grow, not to necessarily handle these different planes of motion and these different ranges of motion at the intensity and the speed or for the duration you will see on the court or the field. And so, making sure that, you are training for functionality as well. And that's where, going into some basic points about it is, both endurance and power and range of motion. Like if you can focus kind of on those variables, can you do something for a lot of reps with little to no weight? Can you do something heavy with, a decent bit of weight or relative strength to you? And then can you do it fast? I think if you can do those three things, a lot of times that you will be less likely to, I guess fourth, can you move through those different planes of motion? Mm-hmm. But I think if you can do those, you're generally going to check a lot of boxes.
Excellent. All right, let's talk about one-to-one versus group. I think we hit this a little bit earlier. If you're listening or if you're listening to these piece by piece, we talked about what I might not be getting from my high school sport, strength and conditioning program. So let's talk about one-to-one. It's probably like the number one way to get the attention, like you're filling the attention gap. But what are maybe some other benefits or some less well-known benefits from getting a one-to-one trainer for my athlete?
Yeah, I think number one, like we talked about earlier, is just filling gaps. It's easier to fill the gaps in a one-on-one setting. It's hard to fill those gaps as well when you're in a group setting. And so when someone has another program that they're following, or they're following a high school strength program and coming in to train with us, it's easier to monitor and manage training stresses and volume in a one-on-one setting. I think just like you said as well, getting that one-on-one attention, it's easier to not have these misses like we just talked about, right? Like what are the most missed or preventable injuries? And you can do more things and focus on when I'm in my lunge or my single leg position, am I stacked, through the joints properly? Am I creating the right type of torque through the joint? Am I able to get through full ranges of motion in the joint with what my body's designed to have? Can I improve or increase that over time, right? Some people in some places can, some won't. So do we need to just work with what we got, or do we need to improve that range of motion as we go? I think there's a lot of things that make it much easier, because you're able to just give that one-on-one attention to detail. You also start talking about one-on-one. I think the most basic one for people is you have a program built specifically for your goals with a coach that's watching almost every rep you do. A good one-on-one coach, they will see 80 to 90% of the repetitions you do, and they can emphasize and correct, in the moment.
So to kind of riff on this, like let's say I'm listening to this and I don't have a gym that I go to, and I'd love to get a one-to-one trainer for my coach. So what are some evaluation criteria that I should think about, like as a parent or even like a sport coach? Like let's say I coach like football or basketball, and I'm like, well, I want to get round this out and get a trainer for one or two of my kids, what are kind of on your list of like knockout questions or maybe opt-in questions? Like, here's what you want to look for when trying to find a trainer, particularly when it comes to sports performance.
Yeah, I think, what is their background? Not necessarily education. What's their experience like? I've seen great coaches on both ends with, all the knowledge in the world. I've seen coaches with, no real formal knowledge, but a ton of experience, and they're both great, right? And so what do you trust? What do you want? I think that's going to be the first step. Like, what's going to give you that comfort to stick it out? Because if you're not going to, that's going to be the number one factor is sustainability. If you're not going to stick it out, you're not going to get much out of it, right? So if I can find someone I can trust, I've got that. I think in regards to, from a training standpoint, am I working through different planes of motion? Am I incorporating the 6 foundational or fundamental human movements? And then really, am I looking at this, the various components of physical fitness, right? Huberman and Galpin both talk about the 9 components of physical fitness. And if you cover almost anything you do exercise-wise can fill one of these 9 components. And if you have a way to implement those well-rounded, that's where you're going to see the best long-term support. And so finding ways to implement that, you could just go to Google and type in 9 components of physical fitness. If you attach Andy Galpin and Andrew Huberman behind it, I'm sure they'll pop right up. You'll probably get a YouTube clip talking about it. So I think those are really the best resources, best principles to think about when it comes to how to do this on your own. Am I incorporating those foundational human movements? And then am I creating something that's well-rounded? And by well-rounded, am I focusing on my skill and technique? Am I focusing on something that does produce a little bit of power? Am I focusing on something that produces strength or maximal force, muscular endurance, my aerobic capacity, my anaerobic capacity, meaning my long duration steady state, right? Something that's 30 minutes or longer. And that's where it's hard to do all that in one, and you may not be focusing on that, all of those things at once, but over the course of a year, 2 years, 5 years, your training plan, do you have an emphasis in these areas to help make sure you're bringing the well-rounded system up?
So it sounds like if I'm evaluating a coach, number one, there's the trust component. What do I need to know to validate trust? It might not be formal education, but it could be a mixture of formal education plus years of experience.
Correct.
I'd probably put a caveat in there with proven performance. I can see your athletes. I've seen results. I've seen that you've produced the outcome that I'm looking for.
That's what I would say by experience. Yeah.
Yeah. And then on the second part, kind of the movement piece, like that's another evaluation. Are you hearing them, that coach that I'm evaluating, are you hearing them talk about this when it comes to their philosophy, where they're going to be taking my athlete? Like, what's their approach if they have one? I think I'd almost put two more in there. One, do they even have a facility? Because I think that matters too. Or am I going to a Y and is that equipped to do the type of things that we want to do? Am I going to a private coaching studio where it's just small? There's not a lot of room to maneuver for some of the things that we're talking about. I think that's a big one. And how far do you have to drive? The best trainer that's too far away to have the level of dosage that you need to get value out of it might be worthy to consideration. If it's a finer skill, I know people that go to like a quarterback's coach. They'll drive 90 minutes for that, but it's not like a 3 times a week thing, whereas sports performance would be something like that. So
absolutely.
Excellent. All right, moving on. This one's a mouthful. All right. We are going to transition from kind of a youth and like our formal idea of what we would think of as an athlete. We think of like youth athletes, middle school athletes, high school, pro athletes all around. I want to talk about non-traditional athletes like me, Eric, and like you now.
It's like me
right?
now. Yeah, me as well.
So working adults, we want to compete and train in their sport of choice. Like a caveat I'll put on this is after college, many of the people listening, you can recognize, or even high school for some, or even middle school for some, there are very few sports that we're called out to play. You're not on teams anymore using your body to physically do anything. No one cares what your score was. So in comes the rise of marathons, 5Ks, triathlons, mud runs, Spartan races. Now, like everyone's playing pickleball. Like there's these things are arriving because there is a force inside of us that it like the finish lines and the opportunities die away well before our interest and our physical need for that goes away. So you're left in this kind of vacuum where it's like, all right, athletes. When you think about athletes, everyone, you've been thinking of this, like, oh, I'm not an athlete. I sit at a desk all day. I drive a truck all day. I stand behind here all day. I talk to people all day. I'm doing Zoom calls all day long. But I think shifting gears in a lot of ways, the best leaders that I work with actually think and treat themselves like athletes. They have mindset coaches. They have meditation practices, breathing practice. They have all of these things that you would expect an elite athlete to do. They get paid money to be an athlete because they're managing energy, stress, hormones, all those things that I know that you and I talk about a lot. So what about it? What about them that they still want to compete? And how is sports performance training maybe different for them than it would be for a youth where it's like, I'm not going to be doing that. Well, what would I be doing? Yeah. And again, I know I'll caveat that depends on what I'm training for, but just in general, and you can even dance around the different type of things that we've seen people training for that you've worked with.
Yeah, I think one of the big things that you're going to see in an older adult athlete is going to be stress management, right? Management of overall stresses. And to kind of, before I dive into this, counteract or talk about what you said, I sit at a desk all day. I'm a truck driver all day. If you've ever heard of a company called Nike, their co-founder, Bill Bowerman, he once said, if you have a body, you're an athlete, right? And so anyone if you're human, like you're an athlete of life, right? And so when it comes to training for someone that does have a sport we're working for, right? There are definitely things that are different, but there's also a lot of overlapping variables. One of the biggest ones you're going to see, like I said, stress management. At the end of the day, when you go to sleep, the body doesn't say, okay, I'm just going to recover from my training stress over here, but I'm going to leave work and family stress for another day. And we'll do that tomorrow, but then you go and train tomorrow, and you can't stack those for very long, right? So, when we sleep is going to be a big part of when you recover from stresses. So sleep management, I think, falls right into that. I think paying attention to those stresses are really important. I think the other thing that I talked about is lower emphasized in the youth side, but needs to be highly prioritized more in an adult realm is, your warm up and your down regulation, preparing the body for the demands it's about to ask. I like to use the analogy a lot. It's like a car, right? You see muscle cars from the 50s and 60s that still look and run beautifully, but how much maintenance and work have they had on them regularly throughout the years? And how much time and energy has been put into those to make sure that they still look and run the way that they do. And we see a lot of those effects in the human body. Huberman and Galpin actually talked about this. A lot of the things that we think deteriorate as we age, we're actually starting to see you can contribute all of those things specifically to lack of training them. The first thing they talk about that you start to see as you age is speed and power. As you start to often see in the 30s and really into the 40s, in aging athletes, speed and power goes down. When's the last time you see people, you saw multiple people over the age of 30 sprinting or max effort jumping or doing a heavy Olympic lift, right? But they haven't set the base to do that. If they go out and try to do that, they're not ready. So that's where did I, one, prepare my body for the demands I'm about to ask of it? Two, do I actually have the tissue tolerance to do that demand yet, right? Like, have I laid the foundation to bulletproof the body enough that it can be resilient enough to handle that stress, right?
Yeah, well, I think you used some language matters.
Correct.
And I think when you think of non-traditional athletes, they call it like, I'm going to go exercise. I'm going to go work out.
Yep.
I'm going to get a good hard workout in. They don't use the language of train. And I think that's a mindset
exercise
shift. You know what I mean? Where I'm going to train today, which means that what I'm doing today is for something else.
Yep.
Instead of, I'm just going to go beat myself into a mud puddle. I'm going to go run as long as I can today. I'm going to go. And I think, things have come a long way in running. Like where you see there's like maps, there's kind of periodization tables for like when to taper, swimming. Like in sport, you see that, but it's like the middle of the bell curve.
Yep.
Out there that's like, I think I could do something again, or I should do something. First of all, I'd tell you, yes, you should, 100%. Because it's going to help you in a lot of places. Per what Eric said, like even managing stress in like relationships, home, like work-life stress, it's going to help you have more energy, confidence, endurance, resilience, grit, all these things. You're like, I wish I could be like that. You totally can. But like, I think that going back to where I pin that is like the language that you use. Yeah. And being around people that use that language probably doesn't hurt either. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think, kind of going to what you adding on to what you just said about go do something, I do keep saying, do you have the ability to do this? Do you have the ability to do this? Well, that's also the point of training, is to build the ability to do that. It's just, can you handle the amount of volume, the intensity you're pushing that volume at? Can I handle that much frequency? How often I'm doing it? Those are all variables you got to pay attention to when we're adding stresses in, because that is the point of training. And really anything, when it comes to building resiliency, grit, things like that, it's, am I putting myself into a challenging situation that stresses me, that I can come out on top of to create a positive adaptation? And if I go to sleep and I have that kind of break time or that down regulation time from that, neuroplasticity comes out, as Huberman says, and, it allows us to adapt and become better at that stress we just faced. And so, that is the point of training, is to be able to build more tissue tolerance, to be able to build more range of motion, more strength through that range of motion, all these things. You just can't go out balls to the wall and do all of it right at once, 100%. You got to figure out where your starting point is. You got to do some self-assessment, especially if you're doing this on your own. You got to find, you can go to Google and find all sorts of assessments online. Physical therapy ones are going to be a little more joint by joint. We do a little bit of both, coordination through some movement, but then we also do some joint by joint that we want to see to make sure, can you handle the things that we're commonly going to do in here? And if you can't, then we need to work on that first before we can start really focusing on the bigger things that you want to emphasize.
And you bring up a couple of things. One of my beliefs is, and I'd be hard pressed to find someone who probably would refute this, although it's the internet, you can find anybody to refute anything, I believe that someone who's getting back to training or has never done it needs a coach far more in a lot of cases than youth athletes do.
Yeah.
Youth athletes are more durable, resilient. They can get away with eating anything. If you have kids and you're listening to this, you know what I'm talking about. How did you do that? Yeah. How did you come back from that training? Versus you get older, the risks in starting to do these type of things, to sprint, power, all the things we talked about, seem to be higher. The risk reward is higher, particularly early on. So I think meeting with a coach, whether it's wherever you're at and listening to this, it's a great beginning assessment. Once you've pinned down, what are you motivated to do? So sports performance there's a performance output I'm looking for. Once I want to do a blank, that's for you to decide. But meeting with a coach to get some kind of assessment and talk through where you're at, even if you pay 1 or 2 or 3 times just to know where you're starting from, then you go online. Then you go with the program somewhere else. Now you're at least all right, I got a good general sense of awareness, physical awareness, where do I need to move? And then you can come back to that same coach for even reassessment if you never darken the doorstep of their gym before.
And I think, I can play devil's advocate to both sides of this. I think from a youth standpoint, that neuroplasticity I talked about, the brain's ability to wire and coordinate things, it's much more receptible at a younger age. And so they can see faster adaptations, and you're going to see coordination oftentimes pick up faster in someone because they've never been taught poorly. Naturally you watch babies and little kids, they squat well. And part of that's how their body's designed, right? They have a bigger head, gives them better counterbalance. But at the same time, we have all these natural movements we do, but we stop performing them as we age and we lose the capacity and ability to do them. And so, you teach a youth athlete. So teach a youth athlete really, really well from the beginning. I think that's just as important as an adult athlete, but I think it takes fewer sessions with them more often than not than what you need to follow up with an adult athlete because of the more cumulative stresses that have been placed on the body over decades, the small little injuries. Dr. Kelly Starrett, he's one of the leading experts in physical therapy and around performance training and strength training. He was actually one of the first early CrossFit affiliates. His company's the Ready State as well, if you want to look into him. But I've been listening to him a lot lately, and he asks every speech he does, whether it's 5 people or 500, how many of you deal with pain? And at every place he goes, 98 to 99% of them raise their hand, right? So pain's normal. Pain doesn't mean it's a problem. Pain is a warning sign, so it doesn't mean something's wrong. It just means that you may be headed for something wrong. It's a warning sign. And so, with adults, you start running into that higher risk because most of them are going to deal with more pain or more cumulative pain that prevents or restricts them from doing things.
Awesome. All right. So next up, we just talked about how sports performance training might be different as we get older. So talk about the types of training that maybe 40, 50-year-old athletes should avoid. And we can add in at the end what they maybe should do, but let's start with what we should avoid.
Yeah, I think the big thing is the intent and the understanding to not rush. Give yourself time. Don't rush into things because I think that's where most people go wrong.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah, so you want to start running and you go out and you haven't ran in, even a year or two in your 40s, and you go out and decide, I'm going to run a 5K, and you haven't ran in a year, what are your shins and your feet and your knees going to be telling you at the end of that, right? Most of us too, again, we don't really warm up very well. We'll warm up in the first mile, I'm as guilty of this as anyone at times. And so, making sure that, you are not rushing into anything you're doing. I think the other things, again, preparing yourself for the demands that the task requires. I think one of the big issues you'll see a lot of elderly people rush into, so to get a little bit more into some...
Hey, we're talking 40 and 50-year-olds. Yep. All right, so come on, man.
So 40 and 50-years get into...
I don't call myself elderly yet.
Sprinting or running. Like I said, running's a big one, because the forces that we have to put into the ground, each step and each stride we take... it's multiple times of our body weight depending on how fast you're running. And so do I have the tissue tolerance? Do I have the joint tolerance? Do I have the range of motion to handle all that?
Right.
So I think typically you're going to see more issues and more elastic or ballistic and dynamic movements early on. Like you're running, you're jumping, you're sprinting, something that's more dynamic. But those are important to not avoid, but to build yourself into because, as you age, again, I don't want to go too far elderly, but, one of the big things that does limit people is they break a hip or they from falling. And so do I have the quick twitch response to catch myself in a fall, right? If I don't have the quick twitch response and I don't train how to train quickly to react quickly, then I become much more resilient to injury. And it's something that I mention this because if you don't do it in your 40s and 50s and don't start until you're 60, 70, 80 years old, you can still see progress. It's still better than not doing it. But if you start in your 40s, 50s, and even before, you see even greater benefits. The longer you start something and stick with it, the better benefit you're typically going to have from it. And so if I start at my 40s and 50s, now I'm setting myself up to be more resilient, as I get into the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I have better bone density. I have better tissue tolerance. I have more elasticity in the joints. I have better range of motion because I haven't been locking myself up through those positions for a while. It's important that you move through as full a range of motion as possible. The greater range of motion you move through, we release synovial fluid from the spine. That is lubrication of the joint. And so if I'm not doing these things in my 40s and 50s, it's going to be much more difficult to do, in my 60s and 70s. I was actually talking to my general physician about this just this past week, and some of the issues he sees. And he was talking about, some of the common things that you're seeing, but they're at a much younger age than they used to be. Type 2 diabetes, he just diagnosed someone at 27, I think, recently, type 2 diabetes. Type 2 is totally lifestyle inflicted. Some people may have a higher disposition, so I don't want to say there's not genetic variables involved, but type 2 can be controlled by lifestyle variables. And you typically don't see that or didn't see that, decades ago until you're 60, 70, 80 years old. But this guy's already prescribed insulin, right, at that age. So, but it's the thing, the issue he has, another guy had a heart attack and he warned him about a month in advance. Like, hey, you smoke 2 packs a day, your blood pressure's like 180 over 130 or something like that, something crazy high. And he warned him, hey, you're going to have a heart attack. The guy's like, I'm 37, I'll be fine. And it was about a month later, he had a heart attack. And we want to wait until something serious happens. We have that kind of oh crap moment that says, I need to get my stuff in check now or it's going to get real bad. Well, if you can start doing those things earlier, you avoid that oh crap moment.
Right.
And that oh crap moment, you may come out on the positive side, but you might not. You like to think if you have a heart attack at a young age, well, I was young, it's rare, it didn't happen. But if I treat my body like crap, can my body come back from that? So I think that's really important with a lot of adults is working on the things now that you're going to face when you get in 60, 70, 80 years old. And if you can't do those things now, avoid them for the now, but build yourself into being able to do.
So it sounds like avoid doing nothing. Like
Correct.
that, we'd frame that through avoid. But I think, and the other thing that you shared is like ballistic movements, like right out of the gate, or like running or going full into the thing without some buildup. I think one thing I'd even add in there too is training intensity and frequency.
Yep.
Coupled with like recovery and rest.
Yep.
Where I think 40 and 50 year olds, like I being one, and like working with a lot of them and training with a lot of them, There's kind of two, it's easy to categorize, like it oversimplify, but you have two different kind of mindsets. Like one mindset is just this go so hard, 10,000 RPM mindset, which I feel like I'm more aligned with, where the harder thing is programming, recovery, and rest. So I need to be more intentional about it. Like I have to take that way more seriously than, did I go hard enough? I rarely ask myself that question, and then it's like, well, how many days should I work out, or how long should I go? More is always the right answer, right? To those
Typically.
people. On the other side, you can have not enough. And then your expectation is here, but your training volume and intensity is way too low for an outcome that you want, because they maybe hang on too long for the babying phase. We're like, all right, you're walking now. You're walking. You can run now. I think I like walking. I think I'm going to walk. Well, then we need to recalibrate the performance outcome that you're hoping for and all those things. So I think that's another avoid, is like going too hard too long, because I'm looking at 20 somethings, 18 somethings to try to like calibrate. Well, I could probably still do that. Like it's this ego leading instead of this ultimate outcome that I'm there for.
Yeah. Well, I think Will Fleming's a good resource on this. He's based out of Bloomington, Indiana. But he works with a lot of youth and high school performance athletes, but he also works with a lot of masters Olympic weightlifters. He holds masters world records in, I believe, the 35 to 39-year-old class. I don't think he's competed since he's gotten his 40s, but I could be wrong on that. Don't shoot me, Will. But anyways, he has a guy that I want to say he's in his mid-late 40s that, he's crushing numbers in snatch and clean and jerk right now. He's been doing it for really the last year and a half, 2 years, but he has a lot of good information on masters training. They can tend to handle high amount of frequency and intensity, but you have to have a significant reduction in volume. And so that's where a lot of things go wrong, is we want to go hard and then we want to do a lot of it at once. And it's like in masters, if you actually just go up and kind of touch really hard and then just step away or back away, you can see really great adaptations from that. Now, just like everything else I mentioned before, you got to set that foundation first. Like this guy didn't just jump into snatch in 330, right? But he does now. Well, I believe actually well over that. I don't know. Anyways, masters can tend to handle intensity and frequency high. It just can't be very much.
You heard it here first. Old man's strength is real, and old woman's strength is real. All right, let's transition that. This is a good crossover point. So one of the reasons I think a lot of 40, 50-year-olds don't get into sports performance style training, or even HIIT training, CrossFit style training, is I'm going to get hurt. I know I'm going to get hurt. I'm going to get injured. I hear a lot of people get injured. So let's just bring some actual science to bear here, and empiricism in terms of what are the injuries for athletes in their 40s and 50s that want to continue sport, continue doing things like rec basketball, running, maybe even sprinting, sports that do require a level of being an athlete.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So really a lot of the common ones you're going to see, especially as athletes get in their 40s and 50s, back pain. Most people have dealt with some sort of back injury, back pain, some sort of disc issue at some point. I've had several discussions with many chiropractors that say if you were to take an MRI of the entire population, 80 to 85% of them would have a herniated disc somewhere along the lines. They just don't know it. A lot of times if we decrease the stress on it and we allow it to recover and heal and go through the proper progression for certain things, you can recover those issues without surgery. I had a few myself, got some chiropractic work, so it wasn't something I could do all on my own, but with the help of some chiropractic work and then a therapist that just gave me exercises to do on my own. I didn't go see a therapist regularly. I was able to come back and hit bigger and better weightlifting numbers than I had ever hit pre-disc issue. So I think some sort of spinal issue is very common. You also see a lot of tennis elbow. I imagine that you might see that on a skyrocket as pickleball continues to skyrocket. And then stress fractures, just simple, especially in the shins, down the shins and around the knees, you see these small little repeated stress fractures because, again, we kind of get that motivation, and with the motivation, we try to do too much, and the body's not tolerant enough for it. It's not ready to handle those stresses. So we end up getting these small little micro tears or micro fractures in the body.
Well, let's break those two down. I want to break down tennis elbow with you, and I want to break down the shins. So let's start with tennis elbow. So how can sports performance maybe help me prevent these? I want to play pickleball. I want to do this. I'm 40, 50, 60 years old. I don't want tennis elbow, but I want to do the activity. What are a couple things that sports performance, if you're programming for somebody, you might be doing? I'm using might to help them.
Well, there's actually one I left out that I probably should have mentioned, but it actually tees up for, I think, a lot of the common reasons you're going to see in tennis elbow is a rotator cuff or shoulder issue. Especially, you're seeing a lot more, I would say, the last decade with the technology, the sitting, the forward postures, and we're getting kind of locked in these positions, and we can't open up and go overhead without really getting up into the neck and the trap muscles. And so when I lose the ability closer to the midline, you're going to see that compensate down chain. And so when I don't have the position or range of motion at my shoulder and I need to go do something with my hand that requires rotation, well, now I have to create it somewhere else down that chain. And so it can create more torque and stress than it's designed to handle. This is designed to have some rotational torque in it, but you don't want to focus on a lot of rotational stress in the elbow or the wrist, right? That's part of what caused my dislocation of the elbow. So, it's something that you want to make sure that you have good strength, stability, joint function around the midline first, and then what's that look like down chain? So a lot of times that tennis elbow is going to get locked up because I have to do a lot of this forearm backhand swing. You'll see it in golf because of kind of that rotation when you come through. Well, if I don't have the ability to rotate through the trunk and the shoulders well, that's going to trickle down, and now I have to rotate more than what these joints are designed or want to do. Even if they can handle it, it's not going to be optimal through force and power, right? And so if I want to be better at my sport, it's not just go harder. I need to learn how to use the right muscles correctly.
So you would program things that work that shoulder, that work that twisting motion. So I'm using more of my body and I'm not isolating in that elbow and putting it all right in one place.
Typically, you still need to address the pain. So like a lot of times I refer to pain. You'll hear a lot of therapists talk about this too. Physical therapists say pain's a neighbor. It's an angry neighbor, right? And so it's something that's either upstream or downstream from where you feel that pain that's causing the problem. And so I still need to address the pain. And this is what you're going to see a lot in physical therapy, and I don't want to down talk physical therapy because there's a lot of great physical therapists out there, but there are some that just take you through a basic protocol, build the insurance and keep you rolling. And it's not really going to help you get to where you're trying to get back to. It's just getting you back to, can I drive to work? Can I sit at my desk? Can I write, with a pen well? If I can do those things well, then that's, what the healthcare system is designed to get you back to, not playing golf, not playing tennis, not, whipping it up on the pickleball court, right? And so if I don't have that rotation through here, I'll see that trickle down chain, but I still need to get rid of this pain or I'm not going to be able to get that to work, function up top either. So it's a balance. It's kind of like a spectrum. I need to address this still, and I'll do that through generally low intensity or low stress isometric movements. Even a basic bicep curl where I'm squeezing at the top and I'm controlling down on a 10-second count, right? Just to hear my elbow crack there. And do it with different positions of the wrist or the forearm, right? Because now I'm working that joint a little bit different plane or a little bit different range of motion and strengthening those tissues around there a little bit differently. And so I need to do things like that, or I would address things like that for the pain. But if I don't go back and address that root cause, that pain's going to keep coming back in the picture.
All right. So let's talk about the shins next. I work with a lot of track athletes right now, young kids that are having a lot of shin issues. What are a couple of your go-tos from a sports performance standpoint to preventing these from ever even showing up?
Yeah, a lot of shin stuff. I think the tibialis anterior gets highly neglected. It's really a basic thing you can do at home is just stand with your back on a wall. Ben Patrick's really kind of popularized this lately, the knees over toes guy. And so stand butt and back against the wall, put your feet together, 6 to 10 inches away from the wall. And all you're trying to do, keeping your legs straight, is flex your toes all the way up to your shins, pause for a second, and then back down. And challenge yourself with this. It's going to get boring. By the time you get 10, 15 reps, what's commonly prescribed in kind of the exercise realm, you're going to be like, this is stupid. This is what happened to me the first time I heard him talk about this. And I used to do these a little bit at my internship down in Tampa, but we'd go 3 sets of 15 usually, never go above 20. And Ben Patrick's talking about doing sets of 25 to 30. And I'm like, I'm just going to see what this does. And I get to about 15. I'm like, this is stupid. Like, why am I still doing this? By the time I got to 23, I almost couldn't flex my toes up anymore. right? And so it's something that, you know, I hit that hard wall, and then they said, hey, I don't want to do any more work. And so it's something that you can build that up where you're doing 30, 40, 50 of them at a time.
Gosh.
The closer you are to the wall, the easier it is, the further your feet are away from the wall, the harder
Which goes to show you like how many reps you're doing when you're running or when you're sprinting or when you're changing direction, or like how many miles a soccer player goes or a tennis player, pickleball player goes during the course of activity. And that's a real eye opener where it's like, how many of those did you just do? Oh, like 30. And I asked you to do 50. I couldn't.
Yep.
Like think about that rep exchange. Yep. Like, wow, I wonder why my bones are giving way. I wonder why my muscles starting to pull away from it's just like literally wanted to stop 50, 60 reps in of the other activity. Yep. But somehow we feel like, oh, I'm on a court doing it here. It's going to be fine. Whereas like your body will force you to, it'll just, all the compensation starts happening when you wonder like, why does my hip hurt? Like, why does my knee, and you keep working back up to the middle of the chain. It's like, well, because of this.
It's fine early on in the game or the event, right? But as you go on, you got to withstand. You need the capacity of that. I actually Coach Jason Roberson over at Ball State. I was over setting up for baseball, and men's volleyball program was up on the board, and he had a Peterson step down or Peterson step up program, and it's basically just a little like heel tap where you're just getting kind of end range knee flexion and then extending back up. And we'll do these a lot at the gym, and I'll program usually 20 to 30 reps at a time. You get a nice little pump from them. But he had the volleyball guys doing sets of 70. They had 2 sets of 70. And I'm like, good for you. Like, how do you get your guys to not stay bored in that? And he goes, well, they kind of do, but I got to remind them what it's for. And as we said, he goes, when they go 5 games deep, how many jumps do you have on the court?
Oof.
Right? And so I want to make sure your knees can handle that much flexion extension over and over and over again. You know, and it goes back to that. It depends variable. What's your intent? You know, if I think, okay, well, I need to be doing sets of 70. Well, can you even do 10? Right? Can you do 20? Can we get to 30 without breaking down? Can I maintain, you know, my mechanical tension and my mechanical positions well as I go? Or am I just fighting through a bad position that I'm putting more stress in the body, right? When you get on the field or the court, you don't know what position you're going to be in. But if I can train to stay stacked or to stay in these common positions that I know are safe, and I can build resiliency around the joints and the tissues there, like that only just helps prepare and minimize that risk on the field or the court.
Excellent. Well, like thanks for sharing like the way sports performance can kind of address and prevent a lot of these injuries. I'm going to skip ahead to this one here. And I want to move to some of the athletes that are actually over 50 into 60s, 70s, 80s. And I want to talk about how what we've discussed so far can influence a person's life and health span for the whole duration, 0 to 100, 0 to 150. Who knows how long we're going to live anymore.
Yeah. So I think it kind of set up earlier, a little bit I touched base on earlier, you know, doing the things that you do early on influences, and if you can continuously stick it out, is going to influence what happens over time, right? Think about if you're playing the stock market, right, and you do it over the course of 30, 40, 50 years, and you do it well, what's your bank account look like in 50 years as opposed to 5 or 10 years, right? Now, that being said, you still have to do it well, right? And if you don't know how to do that, you do have to have some experimentation. You got to figure out some things on your own, but at the same time, like, you need someone or something that you can trust that helps support and guide you along that way. You know, one of the biggest ones you're going to see is bone density, right? You can still see great results. If you've never strength trained, you're 70 years old, you can still see great results in terms of improved bone density by strength training. But especially for a female, this is really interesting. I heard Andy Galpin talking about this recently on a podcast. You know, we're starting to see more individual research geared at females. And especially, you know, female research gets difficult, especially time of the year and certain metrics we're working on around their hormonal cycle, right? But he said that we actually see a huge drop-off I would say drop-off, but a huge increase in bone density if you start strength training in your 20s or younger and maintain it through life. As you get into your 30s and you don't start, you know, after that, you can still see, again, significant improvement. So I don't want to steer anyone away from like, well, it's too late for me, but if I can start now and I'm, you know, before 30 years of age, I'm setting myself up at 70, 80, 90 years old. Again, if I do it relatively well to, you know, live a better life at 60, 70, 80 years old, I can, you know, hopefully handle the falls that may happen or occur. You know, I can handle the stress of picking up my grandkids off the ground. But if I don't have the ability if I don't start focusing on my 20s, I see some diminishing return. I can't see as much improvement if I start in my 40s or 50s.
Right. And it goes back to those foundational movements, doing them consistently, programming them in an irrelevant fashion, regardless of the activity in your life. Like, how many times do we hear, "Oh, I just don't have time."
Yep.
And it's like, well, like you're only going to get more of what you're currently getting if you're with what you're doing, which could be true with work, career, family, etc. And if it's working for you, that's great. But there's some things that aren't optional. As I'm training people in like sales and negotiation, for instance, you have to do all 5 phases of like selling, of negotiating, of influencing. It's not going to work. Period. You don't get to choose. I think a lot of times when you don't prioritize for like energy, agility, mobility, strength, health, like you get the bone density problems, you get the coordination, like it literally goes away. It's the foundation upon which all of the other things are built. And it's so easy how we defer to, I got stuff with my kids, or I got stuff with my wife. And it's like, there's just no spot for it. And it's just, you don't know what you're mortgaging. It's the reverse stock market. It's literally, you're taking all the money you put in out before you even need it. You're like, man, why do I feel like such garbage? I'm only 50. I'm only 60. Anymore, it's going to be, I'm only 70 and 80. And you're going to be like, unfortunately, I might have 40 more years in this husk of a body. I think people are starting to wake up to that. I think it's easy to see for the 37-year-old gentleman who had the heart attack and all these other things. Like, you have that happening on one end, but I'm seeing a reawakening at these later stages that, like, I got to do something about this, and people are taking action.
One of the biggest things we see improvement in bone density on is axial loading. So actually loading the spine or loading the body. Using, it doesn't have to be a barbell, but, doing some form of a deadlift, of a squat, or putting weight on the body or in your hands that you have to stabilize the core and the trunk and keep it tall and rigid, and get it to move through these different planes of motion. And so, but the more that you use or implement, I would say the more, but the better you balance and implement axial loading, oftentimes we're going to see better improvement in that bone density as well.
That's awesome. Load up, everybody.
That's right.
So, I guess like we'll hit this one really quick. Much like the youth, what are the best resources for learning more about training? If I'm an advanced stage athlete, if I have one in my life, maybe it's a parent or grandparent, where should I aim them to say, hey, I want them to get started doing something. We don't have a gym that focuses on something like this locally, or coaches. Where would you point me?
So my number one resource I would go to for advanced stage athletes or longevity-based athletes would be Dr. Peter Attia. He's really, I would say, one of the experts leading the forefront, or doctors involved in research and understanding, like, how do we kick ass better as we age, right? So Peter Attia would be a big one. Dr. Andy Galpin is another one. I've referenced him several times in this podcast. I'm a little biased because he got his PhD work done at Ball State, and I got to learn a little bit from him hands-on, which was really cool. So he's a great resource in all things performance, nutrition, to sought out at any age. And then Danny Foley is actually one that I like a lot. He works a lot with, I think he's branched off and started his own thing the last few years, but I first ran into him at a Sornex seminar conference. He was the head coach at Virginia High Performance. And he worked with a lot of disabled veterans and military people that were actually still trying to make it, but they had already been kind of checked to the side and thought that their career was done. And it's like, how do you get these people that, have all this loss of function back? And so he's a great resource of, I refer to him as a human performance coach. He really helped clarify something that I like to talk about with our coaches, but like, as a coach, you're a problem solver. Someone comes to you with a problem. How do you solve it? Right. Mm-hmm. And so, as you get into athletes with advanced ages, or, a little bit more of those people in their 70s, 80s and above, they've had more stress and wear and tear on the body. And so there's some problems that you may have to deal with a little bit differently than others. And so if you don't have someone that helps you understand how to work through and develop those problems, your risk of injury goes up, your risk of sustainability goes down. We see a lot of things that fall into the bucket that don't allow you to see that forward progress like you want to see. And so I think Danny Foley is a great resource to go to as well. All
right. Well, there's 3 good ones. And I'd encourage anybody listening to this, especially if you are an athlete in your 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, beyond, don't punt on yourself. But also don't just try to minimize what you can do. There are resources out there. There's books being written that are basically rewriting what the future is going to look like, and you can take advantage of that for low to no cost. So don't go into it blind, and don't look at what you did before. Like some of the stuff that you might have done 40 years ago when you were training, like we're well past
very
like,
different athlete now.
What you can do. And there are resources that you can seek out to get started and get started with confidence and competence. Obviously, if you can get a one-to-one coach, you can get a personal trainer that passes kind of the standard that Eric talked about earlier. That is the platinum standard. If you can do that, you can afford that, and you have someone locally to do that, it's great. But don't punt on yourself. You likely have a lot more life to live, and it can be really amazing. If you could start training, stop exercising, doing your small thing, and start training for this life that you want to live. With that, we're at time. A couple things I want to leave you with. There's some QR codes there for arsenalfitness.com. If you like what you heard from Coach Eric, he talks about it more. You can connect with him there, any one of our coaches, learn more about what we're doing, and even get some Arsenal Fitness merch if you're interested. For my part, I do a ongoing series and little mastermind sessions on leadership development, sales, assessments, things of that nature on Leadership Talks, and that's in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. So feel free to pause, go back to this if you want to. And if you're out there in cyberspace and you're thinking about like, hey, I want to start and do something, I'd love to work with you guys. I want to learn more about how I could train in my home, with my gym, with my family, or whatever. Eric, Derek, and myself, we've collaborated to build 32 Fit, which is 30 days to group fitness training that you'll see a healthy dose of Eric. You see him on the screen there. Doesn't look much different. Great job. Your longevity training's paying off, Eric. Right. If you hit that QR code, you get to go there to learn more about that, to build on some of these foundational movements that Eric talked about in the comfort of your own home. But like it says on the screen there, in an 8x8 space, you can do everything that Eric trains us on in that program. And we've heard feedback on that it is both accessible and very challenging. So if you're worried, what can I do there? Try it. And see what you think. So thanks, Eric, for being with me today. I appreciate it, and looking forward to the next one.
Thank you.